Judge John Roberts screams at Melania Trump on live TV. John's cold response went viral. The hearing had been set up under the guise of routine, an examination of the Supreme Court's recent ruling on public access to government records. But few in the room, and fewer still in the watching audience, could have predicted what would unfold. The air buzzed with anticipation as Melania leaned forward, ready to ask the questions that had been gnawing at her since the moment she first heard of the court's decision. Then, in a move that shocked everyone present, Roberts, stoic, silver-haired, and confident, decided to take matters into his own hands. He wasn't just here to answer questions, he was here to defend his ruling no matter the cost. And so, he began, his voice steady, his tone dismissive. Melania Trump. Roberts began, his eyes narrowing as he addressed her directly. I understand you may have some concerns, but I must be clear this is not a matter of political gamesmanship. This ruling was made with the utmost care and respect for the principles of national security and administrative efficiency. It's easy to question from the sidelines, but you, of all people, should understand that the complexities of constitutional law require far more than your simple emotional approach. The room fell silent. Melania, seated across from him, remained poised, her expression unchanged. The glare of the fluorescent lights cast a slight sheen on her face, but there was no indication that Roberts's words had the slightest impact on her. Melania had faced far worse criticisms before, especially from the media and the political elite. She knew how to handle attacks, but this was different. This wasn't just a media hit job. This was the Chief Justice of the United States telling her that she didn't understand the very legal system she was questioning. I'm not here for games. Mr. Roberts, Melania responded, her voice calm but laced with the quiet fury that those close to her recognized so well. I'm here because the American people deserve transparency. They deserve to know who's making decisions on their behalf and why those decisions are being made. This ruling, far from protecting the people, seeks to hide the truth, and that's something I will not stand by. The weight of her words lingered in the room, filling the silence with a tension so thick that it could almost be cut with a knife. The members of Congress sitting around the room glanced at one another, unsure of how the exchange would evolve. On one side, they had Roberts, a man whose very presence commanded respect, the embodiment of the judicial system. On the other, they had Melania Trump, a figure who had long been the subject of intense scrutiny and criticism, but now was standing firm in her pursuit of what she believed was right. Roberts, his eyes flashing with irritation, took a moment to steady himself before responding. The issue here, Mrs. Trump, is not the transparency you claim to seek. It's the protection of sensitive government operations. Your appeal for open access to records ignores the reality that some things must remain undisclosed for the safety and security of the American people. This is not about politics, it's about protecting our national interests. Melania raised an eyebrow but said nothing, her silence speaking volumes. The cameras focused on her as she took a breath, preparing for the next round. With all due respect, Mr. Roberts, she said, her voice low and deliberate, I understand the importance of security, but I'm talking about the American people's right to know what their government is doing. It's one thing to keep military secrets and sensitive information under wraps. It's another to hide everyday decisions that affect the lives of ordinary Americans. Your ruling places power in the hands of the elite while shutting out the people who deserve a voice. There was a shift in the room. Some of the committee members, who had been visibly uncomfortable just moments before now, leaned forward in their chairs, sensing that something monumental was unfolding. Roberts's carefully constructed argument was beginning to crack. His calm, practiced demeanor was being challenged by Melania's sharp, calculated questioning. It was a clash of ideologies of principles, and it was clear that this was no longer about the legal nuances of transparency, it was about power itself. For the first time, Roberts seemed rattled. His fingers tightened on the edge of the table, his jaw clenched. The composure that had once defined him began to slip, but it was too late. The moment had already passed. The cameras had captured everything. Across the room, the committee members exchanged furtive glances. Some were nodding, others fidgeting nervously. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. And as the cameras continued to roll, the room knew that they were witnessing something that would dominate the news cycle for days to come. This wasn't just a battle of legal minds, it was a battle for the very soul of American governance. And in this moment, Melania Trump was not backing down. The room remained tense as Melania Trump's challenge to Chief Justice John Roberts hung in the air. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Everyone knew this wasn't just another political exchange. This was a battle that transcended legal arguments. Melania wasn't just questioning a court ruling, she was questioning the very fabric of a system that had long been seen as untouchable. She was standing up for the people, for the silent majority who felt they had been left out in the cold by the powerful elite in Washington, D.C. Across the room, Roberts, his face flushed with frustration, regained some of his composure. He straightened his back, his posture once again a picture of judicial authority. "You misunderstand the nature of the court's role, Mrs. Trump," he said, his voice measured but tinged with the remnants of his earlier agitation. "We do not operate based on popular opinion or the whims of the masses. We operate based on law, based on precedents that ensure fairness and consistency. Public access to government records has always been a matter of balancing transparency with security." Melania leaned back slightly in her chair, the calmest person in the room despite the storm raging around her. She knew that Roberts's defense of his ruling wasn't just about the law. It was about defending a system that had existed for generations, one that had granted too much power to those at the top, while making it harder for the average American to have a voice. "But where is the balance, Mr. Roberts?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. "When ordinary citizens can't access public records that affect their lives, where is the fairness in that? When people in power are allowed to shield themselves behind legal jargon and opaque decisions, how are we supposed to trust our government? You talk about fairness and consistency, but I see a system that is rigged to benefit those with power and connections." Her words echoed through the room. It wasn't just a critique of the ruling, it was a direct attack on the very system Roberts represented. Melania knew this wasn't going to be easy, but she wasn't backing down. The truth was on her side, and she knew it. Roberts shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His eyes flickered for a moment, betraying a hint of unease. He had dealt with countless challengers in his career, but few had dared to question him so directly, and fewer still had done so with such calm authority. But he was no stranger to pressure. He cleared his throat and, with a deep breath, tried to regain control. "This ruling was made with the utmost care," he insisted. "We are not trying to shield government operations from the people. We are trying to ensure that the business of government continues without compromise. The American people deserve transparency, yes, but they also deserve a government that is able to function without the constant threat of leaks that could undermine national security." Melania didn't flinch. "Mr. Roberts, national security is important, yes, but we cannot allow that to be an excuse for a lack of accountability. People rely on public records to understand what their government is doing, to see where their tax dollars are going to know if their officials are acting in their best interest. You're asking us to trust a system that hides information under the guise of security while ordinary Americans are left in the dark." Her words were powerful, calculated, every sentence delivered with precision. She wasn't just fighting for transparency, she was fighting for the very principle that government should serve the people, not the other way around. Roberts's expression hardened. "You're oversimplifying this issue, Mrs. Trump." He shot back, his voice sharp. "This ruling wasn't about hiding information, it's about protecting the integrity of the system. If we allow unrestricted access to everything, there will be consequences. We must protect certain operations in order to ensure that the government can function efficiently and without interference." At this, Melania's lips curled into a slight, knowing smile. "And yet, how much are you really protecting Mr. Roberts?" she asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. "You say it's for the efficiency of the government, but what about the citizens who have no way of knowing what's going on behind closed doors? What about the watchdogs, the journalists, the activists, the everyday people who use those records to keep those in power accountable?" The room was on edge now. The cameras clicked incessantly, capturing every word, every shift in posture. The attention in the room was no longer on the Supreme Court ruling itself, but on the rare spectacle unfolding before them. Chief Justice Roberts, a man known for his measured and unflappable demeanor, had been visibly rattled, while Melania Trump, who had long been dismissed by critics as a figurehead without substance, was now showing a level of poise and confidence that no one had expected. Roberts attempted to steady himself, but it was clear he was becoming increasingly defensive. "The court's ruling is not based on personal opinions, Mrs. Trump. We are bound by the Constitution, by legal principles that have guided this nation for centuries." Melania's eyes locked onto his. The Constitution, Mr. Roberts, is there to protect the people, not the institutions. We're at a crossroads. We have a choice. We can either continue to shield those in power, or we can fight for the people's right to know. You're saying this ruling is necessary for national security, but I'm saying it's a smokescreen for power grabs that leave us in the dark. People have a right to transparency. They have a right to know what's being done in their name with their money. Her words were like a dagger cutting through the legalese and complex arguments Roberts had been presenting. For the first time, Roberts hesitated, caught off guard by the force of her questioning. I understand your concerns. Roberts finally said, his voice quieter but still filled with authority. But you have to understand that this ruling wasn't meant to restrict access for the sake of secrecy. It's about the greater good. It's about ensuring that information that could jeopardize the country's security is kept protected. Melania didn't let him off the hook. And what about the greater good of the American people? Do you think that by hiding information from them, you're somehow protecting them? Do you think they'll be able to trust their government more when they realize that their right to know is being stripped away in the name of national security? Her voice was unwavering. She wasn't just asking questions, she was demanding answers. Roberts, visibly frustrated, leaned back in his chair. He wasn't used to this kind of confrontation, at least not from someone like Melania Trump. For a moment, the thought crossed his mind, was this really just about the ruling? Or was it something more, a challenge to the very authority he had spent years cultivating? Melania continued, unrelenting. People need answers, Mr. Roberts. They need to know what's being done with their tax dollars, with their rights, with their future. We can't allow a system where the people are kept in the dark while those in power operate with impunity. This ruling is the beginning of a dangerous trend, and I won't sit idly by while it unfolds. Roberts opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, he sat there, his face flushed and his hands clenched. The contrast between the two figures couldn't have been more stark. One, the unflappable Chief Justice, now visibly unraveling. The other, Melania Trump, calm, composed, and resolute in her pursuit of the truth. For the first time in this hearing, the room seemed to shift. The focus was no longer on the law, it was on the message being delivered by Melania Trump. She had taken the stage not just as the former First Lady, but as a force to be reckoned with in the political world. And as the cameras continued to roll, one thing was certain: this was only the beginning. The hearing room buzzed with an energy that hadn't been there before. Melania Trump's unwavering composure in the face of Chief Justice John Roberts' outburst had shifted the tone entirely. What was supposed to be a routine discussion of the Supreme Court's recent ruling on public access to government records had transformed into an explosive confrontation, one that went beyond the ruling itself and into the heart of the issues plaguing the relationship between those in power and the people they were meant to serve. Roberts, who had spent decades in the public eye as the epitome of judicial restraint, was visibly shaken. His reputation for calm, measured responses was now in tatters. Melania, on the other hand, had stood her ground, never wavering in her defense of transparency and the people's right to know. The room had become a pressure cooker, and there was no turning back. The cameras zoomed in on Melania as she sat at the witness table, her posture regal and unyielding. Mr. Roberts, she began, her voice cutting through the tension, I'm not here to attack you personally. This is not about your character. This is about the system that is supposed to serve the American people, and it's failing them. You're defending a ruling that removes access to information that could empower citizens to hold their leaders accountable. The public deserves better than this. Her words resonated with those in the room who had been questioning the true motives behind the Supreme Court's decision. It was clear that this wasn't just about law. It was about power, how much power those in charge could wield, and how much they were willing to hide from the people. Roberts, trying once more to regain control, shifted in his seat. His fingers, still visibly tense, gripped the edges of the table. Mrs. Trump, you're mistaken if you think this ruling is about removing people's rights. It's about striking a balance. It's about ensuring that the government can function without constant interference from public scrutiny. We cannot have every decision, every document open to the public. Melania's response came quickly, her tone unwavering yet firm. Balance, Mr. Roberts. There's a difference between balance and secrecy. There's a difference between protecting legitimate state interests and hiding behind a veil of bureaucracy. This ruling will empower the powerful to stay hidden, while ordinary Americans will lose their ability to access the very information they need to make informed decisions. How is that fair? Her words were a direct challenge to the entire premise of the ruling. She wasn't just questioning the decision, she was questioning the very foundation of a system that allowed the elite to control the flow of information while the people were kept in the dark. The room was electric with anticipation. Every eye was on Roberts, waiting to see how he would respond to the force of Melania's argument. He shifted again, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of her scrutiny. "You misunderstand the complexities of this issue," he said, though his voice was less assured than before. "We are talking about sensitive information. There are national security concerns to consider. And let me be clear, the court's role is not to cater to public opinion. It is to uphold the law and ensure that government operations run smoothly." Melania smiled faintly as if she had been expecting this response. "National security is important, Mr. Roberts, but it cannot be used as an excuse to undermine transparency. The people have a right to know what their government is doing, especially when it concerns their lives, their communities, and their futures. I don't think you can justify limiting access to government records by hiding behind national security concerns." Her words rang out across the room, sending a clear message to everyone present. Melania wasn't just a former First Lady asking questions, she was a force in her own right, standing up for the principles that had made America great: freedom, transparency, and accountability. At this point, Roberts could no longer ignore the pressure. He took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing. "You may not agree with the ruling, but this is the decision of the highest court in the land," he said, his tone cold but defensive. "The court has determined that the balance of transparency and national security must lean in favor of the latter. There is no other way to maintain the security of the nation." Melania's eyes locked with his, and for a moment it seemed as though the room had gone completely still. "You call it balance, Mr. Roberts, but what you're doing is giving more power to those who are already in control. You're creating a system where the government operates with less scrutiny and accountability, and that benefits the few at the expense of the many. You're not just protecting national security, you're protecting the status quo, and that's something I refuse to accept." Roberts recoiled as if struck by the force of her words. He had expected pushback, but not with such precision, such clarity. Melania's calm but resolute questioning had peeled back the layers of his arguments, exposing the vulnerabilities beneath. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Roberts might respond with another fiery retort. But instead, he sat back in his chair, his face flushed and his hands trembling slightly. The cameras, ever present, captured every detail of his unraveling composure. This wasn't the dignified Chief Justice the public was used to seeing. This was a man who had been pushed to his limit, and he didn't like it. "I don't believe you fully understand the gravity of what you're asking for." Roberts finally muttered, his voice quieter now. "You want to open up every government document to the public. That's not realistic, and it's not feasible. Some things must remain classified for the safety of the nation." Melania's gaze never wavered. "I understand the need for classification, Mr. Roberts, but the people need access to what matters most, and they can't be kept in the dark forever. You cannot continue to hide behind the veil of national security while undermining the very values that this country was founded on." It was clear now Melania was not backing down, and neither was Roberts. The tension in the room was palpable as the battle over transparency continued to unfold. But one thing was undeniable: Melania Trump had turned the tables on the Chief Justice, and she was making it clear that she wasn't just another political figure. She was a voice for the people, for those who had been silenced for too long. Roberts, now visibly rattled, glanced at the other committee members. His earlier air of invincibility had all but vanished. Melania, on the other hand, sat still, unwavering, ready to continue the fight for transparency and accountability. This was no longer about a ruling. It was about power, the power to control information, the power to decide what the public could and could not know. And Melania Trump was not about to let that power go unchecked. The hearing room had never felt so charged. The tension between Chief Justice John Roberts and Melania Trump was now undeniable. The stakes were higher than ever. What had begun as a debate over transparency and the Supreme Court's ruling on government records had evolved into something more profound: a confrontation over the very nature of power in Washington. Melania, sitting across from Roberts, had transformed from a figurehead into an undeniable force, one whose calm resolve was beginning to unsettle even the most seasoned of politicians. Roberts, his earlier composure now shattered, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He cleared his throat, trying once again to assert control over the room. Mrs. Trump, he began, his voice tinged with irritation. Your questions are valid, but they miss the bigger picture. This ruling was carefully considered to strike a balance between transparency and security. Public access to records may seem like an innocent request, but it's not without its risks. Melania leaned forward, her posture still unshaken. The risks you speak of are nothing compared to the risks of allowing the public to remain uninformed, she replied, her voice cutting through the growing tension. When the people are kept in the dark, when they don't know what's happening with their own government, that's when the real risks emerge. The lack of accountability and transparency breeds corruption and distrust, and that's something I won't stand by while it happens. The room fell silent. It wasn't just her words, it was the unyielding confidence with which she spoke. For the first time in this hearing, the committee members weren't sure which side to take. They were caught between the authority of Roberts, a man who had spent years shaping the judicial landscape, and Melania, who had stepped into this political spotlight with the determination to make a difference. Roberts, who had been on the defensive for much of the hearing, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You are naive if you think that unlimited access to government records will improve transparency, he retorted. In fact, it will do the opposite. Some records need to remain protected for the good of the nation. If you open the floodgates, you risk jeopardizing national security, foreign relations, and the ability to govern effectively. Melania's eyes never wavered. She was unmoved by Roberts's attempt to stifle her argument with lofty rhetoric. Mr. Roberts, the American people are not asking for unfettered access to everything. They are asking for the right to know what is being done in their name. They want to see where their money is going, how decisions are being made, and if their government is acting in their best interest. You keep talking about national security, but at what point does that become an excuse for total secrecy? The question hung in the air unanswered. For a moment, it seemed as though Roberts might break under the pressure, but he quickly recovered. I understand your concerns, he said, his voice less forceful now, though still laced with authority. But this court's duty is not to cater to the whims of the people. Our duty is to uphold the Constitution and ensure that our decisions are in line with the law. The idea that every citizen has a right to access every record is a dangerous path. Melania shook her head slightly as if disappointed. It's not about whims, Mr. Roberts. She responded, her voice steady. It's about the fundamental rights of the people to hold their government accountable. If we start down the path of secrecy, if we allow those in power to hide behind this national security shield, we will lose the very foundation of our democracy. You are talking about the law, but the law is nothing without the people who follow it, and the people deserve better than this. There was a murmur among the committee members, and even some of Roberts's allies seemed to shift uncomfortably. Melania had hit a nerve. She wasn't just arguing a legal point. She was framing the issue as a matter of principle, one that transcended the courtroom and touched on the very ideals that America was built upon. Roberts's jaw tightened, his frustration becoming more evident. You're misunderstanding the implications of this decision, Mrs. Trump. The court cannot and will not be swayed by political pressure or public opinion. This ruling was made with careful consideration of all the facts and with the belief that it serves the long-term interests of the nation. Melania's lips curled into a small smile, but it wasn't a smile of satisfaction. It was the smile of someone who had already anticipated his response. And what about the long-term interests of the people? Are they not part of this equation? You can't keep hiding behind the facade of national security to justify decisions that harm the very citizens you're supposed to protect. Your ruling doesn't serve the people. It serves the elite, the ones who already have power and control. The words landed like a bombshell. Roberts's face flushed and his hands clenched into fists. He had been caught in a trap, one he hadn't expected. The debate was no longer about legal precedents, it was about the fundamental power dynamics at play. The people who had once trusted the Supreme Court were now questioning whether that trust was misplaced. Could the judiciary, which was supposed to serve as the check on power, now be part of the problem? The room felt like it was about to implode. Roberts opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Instead, he sat there, his face a mixture of disbelief and frustration. He had been outmaneuvered, outwitted, and exposed for the first time in his career as someone who had failed to fully grasp the depth of the issue at hand. Melania didn't let him recover. This is not just about a ruling. This is about whether or not our government will serve the people or the powerful few. Your decision may have been carefully considered, but I believe it was wrong. I believe it puts the interests of those in power over the rights of the American people, and I won't stand by while that happens. The cameras flashed. The press took in every word, every moment of this unfolding drama. This wasn't just about legal arguments anymore, it was about the fate of the nation. The questions Melania had raised were bigger than any one ruling. They were about the very principles of democracy, transparency, and accountability. And as the hearing continued, one thing was clear: Melania Trump was no longer just the former First Lady. She was a force in the political arena, and she was ready to take on anyone, especially those who sought to undermine the rights of the American people. The silence in the room was deafening. Roberts, for all his power and authority, was no longer in control. The battle for transparency had only just begun, and Melania Trump had made her presence known. The fight was no longer about a Supreme Court ruling, it was about the very heart of democracy itself. The room was charged with energy, the weight of the confrontation hanging over every individual present. Melania Trump had done what few could have predicted. She had forced Chief Justice John Roberts to abandon his usual composure. With every question, she had chipped away at his defenses, revealing cracks in the judicial facade that had once seemed unassailable. Roberts, despite his years of experience, now seemed out of his depth. His earlier response had been sharp defensive, but the steady pressure from Melania had stripped away the layers of professionalism he had built around himself. For the first time, it was clear that this was more than just a legal debate. It was a matter of power, of who truly controlled the narrative in Washington. The cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every awkward moment. The audience, both in the hearing room and at home, was on the edge of their seats, waiting to see if Roberts would recover, if he could reassert himself, or if Melania would land the final blow. Melania, ever composed, was unfazed. Her eyes never left Roberts as she leaned in just a little closer, her voice unwavering as she delivered her final point. Mr. Roberts, this isn't just about a legal ruling. It's about ensuring that the American people are never left behind, that their voices are heard in every decision that affects their lives. You have a duty to the people not just to uphold the law, but to protect their right to know the truth. And if you can't see that, then it's not just your ruling that's wrong, it's the system itself. The silence that followed was deafening. The tension in the room reached its peak, and for the first time, even Roberts seemed to recognize that he had been bested. His mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came. Melania had said everything that needed to be said. As she sat back in her chair, her gaze unwavering, the room shifted once again. Roberts was no longer the figure of authority. Instead, Melania stood as the true voice of the people, the person who had dared to challenge the very institutions that had long been seen as untouchable. The hearing was far from over, but in this moment, Melania Trump had already won. She had exposed the heart of the issue, a battle for transparency, for accountability, and for the soul of American democracy. The battle for transparency had only just begun, and Melania Trump had made her presence known. The fight was no longer about a Supreme Court ruling, it was about the very heart of democracy itself. The room was charged with energy, the weight of the confrontation hanging over every individual present. Melania Trump had done what few could have predicted. She had forced Chief Justice John Roberts to abandon his usual composure. With every question, she had chipped away at his defenses, revealing cracks in the judicial facade that had once seemed unassailable. Roberts, despite his years of experience, now seemed out of his depth. His earlier response had been sharp defensive, but the steady pressure from Melania had stripped away the layers of professionalism he had built around himself. For the first time, it was clear that this was more than just a legal debate. It was a matter of power, of who truly controlled the narrative in Washington. The cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every awkward moment. The audience, both in the hearing room and at home, was on the edge of their seats, waiting to see if Roberts would recover, if he could reassert himself, or if Melania would land the final blow. Melania, ever composed, was unfazed. Her eyes never left Roberts as she leaned in just a little closer, her voice unwavering as she delivered her final point. Mr. Roberts, this isn't just about a legal ruling. It's about ensuring that the American people are never left behind, that their voices are heard in every decision that affects their lives. You have a duty to the people, not just to uphold the law, but to protect their right to know the truth. And if you can't see that, then it's not just your ruling that's wrong, it's the system itself. The silence that followed was deafening. The tension in the room reached its peak, and for the first time, even Robert seemed to recognize that he had been bested. His mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came. Melania had said everything that needed to be said. As she sat back in her chair, her gaze unwavering, the room shifted once again. Roberts was no longer the figure of authority. Instead, Melania stood as the true voice of the people, the person who had dared to challenge the very institutions that had long been seen as untouchable. The hearing was far from over, but in this moment, Melania Trump had already won. She had exposed the heart of the issue, a battle for transparency, for accountability, and for the soul of American democracy.